Hey guys, welcome back to the 15th video of the Python Tutorials for Beginners series. In this video, we'll be learning about exception handling in Python. When Python encounters a situation that it cannot cope with, it raises an error which stops the program and it prints out an error message in the terminal telling us what went wrong. Okay, so what is a situation that Python cannot cope with? So let's say we have a variable x equal to 1 divided by 0, and then we'll print out x. So in your math class, you probably know that you cannot divide a number by 0. That is not a valid operation. If I run the code, you can see that we get something called a zero division error. And it says division by 0, which is the error message over here. So basically what the error message is saying that, hey, you cannot divide by 0. It's not a valid operation. And our code simply stops at line number 1. So this is one type of error, which is zero division error. Another type of error is let me just show you. So let's make a string hello, and let's say I want to convert this string into an integer. So we can do that by using the int function, and then we'll print out the result. So if x was in fact a integer in a string format, the int function would basically convert this string into integer, and this is what is printed out is an integer. But if we try to convert something like hello into an integer, you cannot do that because this is characters. These are not numbers. So it cannot be done, and we get something called a value error. Basically, it tells us that, hey, you cannot convert a string with characters into an integer. You need to have digits in your string to convert to an integer. Similarly, if you put 10 and a v, we still get a value error because this v over here cannot be converted into a numerical digit. That's why we get a value error. So here we have two errors, value error and zero division error. There are also many other types of error. For example, file not found error, which is when you're doing file reading maybe, and you're trying to look for a file that doesn't actually exist. So if you look for that file and it doesn't exist, then Python will give you a file not found error. So today we'll learn how to deal with errors, because the main issue with errors is that your program is stopped at that line. So over here you can see that the error happens at line number 2, so our program simply stops at line number 2. If you have something after line number 2, let's say I want to print out done. So regardless of whether there was an error, I just want to print out done. If we run the code, you can see that after our error there's nothing being printed out. Alright, there's nothing there. We haven't printed out done. So our program simply stops at line number 2. And yeah, this is not what we want. We want to ensure that our program is executed completely. All our code is executed, and we don't want it to simply stop in the middle. So we can fix this by using a try exception block. So how this works is, let's say so let me show you the syntax. First I type out try, which is a reserved keyword in Python. Next I'll put a colon, enter. Remember that you need to indent. Indentation is very important in Python. And let's say I try to divide by 0. Alright, so next I'll type in except and then exception. Print cannot divide by 0. And then let's say I want to print done at the very end. Alright, so you can see that what happens here is that we try to divide by 0, and actually let me write one more line, print x. Okay, so what happens here is that we start at line number 1, which is try. Next we look at the entire block, the try block, which is line 2 and 3, and then we try to run line 2 and 3. So we first go to line number 2, and then we calculate 1 divided by 0. So as I said, this cannot be done. This is not a valid operation. So what happens in this line is that an exception is raised, which means that the Python interpreter basically says, hey, there is an issue at line number 2 and it raises an error. And you simply skip line number 3 since there was a error at line number 2. All right, so this exception raised over here, we skip line number 3 and we go to line number 4, and then we see except. All right, and this is exception. So what exception is that exception basically refers to every single type of error in Python. For example, this can refer to file not found exception. This can refer to zero division error, which is what we're looking over here. It can refer to value error. It basically catches every sort of error. All right, so in this case, we raise a zero division error, right? Next, so the error over here is caught. That means the error does not stop your Python program. All right, and what happens is that the exception block is then executed. So we go to line number 5, which basically is print cannot divide by 0 over here. All right, and then our program has not stopped because the error raised in line number 2 is caught. All right, so basically this terminology is you raise an error if Python sees something that it cannot cope with, and then you basically catch it or stop that error from terminating your program. All right, and then you deal with the error. So in this case, we're simply printing out a message over here, and then we move on to the program. All right, so the great thing about this is that our code is actually not terminated in line number 2. Our program is executed completely, as you can see, and our error message is also nicely written saying, hey, you cannot divide by 0, rather than this message over here. So we get traceback file blah blah blah. So yeah, instead of printing out these lines, we simply print out cannot divide by 0. All right, so I mentioned that exception refers to every single type of error in Python. So let's say I only want to refer to zero division error. We can do this by simply typing zero division error. If you're wondering how this is happening, you can simply first run the code with the error and you should see the name over here. All right, so this is zero division error. You can simply copy paste that. All right, and then you can see that zero division error, zero division error. All right, so basically the same name. Okay, so here zero division error only refers to a case where you're trying to divide by 0 and hey, you cannot divide by 0, right? So it simply raises the zero division error over here. All right, so if you run the code, you can see that this simply catches the error. All right, so let's say I make another type of error, which is a value error. So let's make a variable x equal to a string hello. I try to convert that into a number, into an integer. Finally, I try to print it out. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to make sure that our program just doesn't stop midway, and we want to ensure that lines 9 and 10, just line number 9, just make sure that line number 9 is executed. So you see that we still get an error. So the reason is that the zero division error does not catch the error raised in line number 3, which is a value error. So value error and zero division error are two different types of error. So we can fix this by using another except block. So this is quite similar to the if, elif, else block, in the sense that you can have many elif statements. So over here you can also have multiple except statements as well. And we'll simply type value error, print cannot convert string with characters to an integer. All right. So make sure that it's a string with characters. If the string has numerical digits, then that is fine. You won't get an error. So if you run the code, so what happens here is that you first try out lines 2, 3, 4, right? So line number 2 is valid. You're simply creating a variable x and assigning the string hello to the variable x. Next, we try to convert the hello string into an integer. So this is where an error is raised, and the error raised is called a value error. So we simply skip line number 4 and then we go to line number 6 and then we check, hey, is this the error? Is the zero division error raised in line number 3? So the error raised here is value error and it's checking for zero division error. So this is not a zero division error, it's a value error. So we go to the next except block, which is line number 9. So this is a value error, which is indeed what was raised in line number 3. So since this is the error that we are trying to catch, we managed to catch that error and we execute line number 10, which is basically printing cannot convert string with characters to an integer. And then we finally print out done. All right, and then if we, let's say, make this into 10, then our code is first this. So the string 10 is assigned to the variable x, then we convert that string into an integer. So now we have v equal to the integer 10. Then we print out v, which is 10. So we get 10. All these lines are skipped because there was no error raised in lines 2 to 4, since nothing's wrong in these lines. So we skip all these lines. Then we go to line number 12, which is print done. So that's what we did. We printed out done to the terminal, and yeah, that's it. That's how our program is run. Okay, so now is another thing called the finally block. So what happens here? Okay, let me make it easier to read. All right. So the finally block is you type finally colon and you put an indent, right? Okay, so what happens here is whatever happens from line number 1 to line number 8, whatever happens, whether there's an error, whether there's no error, whatever happens, we execute the finally block. In this case, we print out done. All right, so no matter what happens, we do the finally block. All right, so previously you saw me not having the finally block doing that, but actually we should have the finally block to improve the formatting a little. Right, so basically the output is quite similar to not having the finally block, but yeah. One more thing is the else block. So this is pretty interesting. Okay, so else, so what happens in else is that basically if there are no exceptions that are raised in the try block over here, then we execute the else block. All right, if there is an exception in these lines, then the else block is not executed. This is different. This is once again different from the finally block, which is executed regardless of whether there was an error raised or not. Okay, so else, in fact, the way you use else is that you simply remove this line and then you put it over here. So I want to print V if I had no error. So let's just run the code and you can see that, hey, we print out 10 and then done. So what happens here is that we first execute these two lines. So the string 10 is assigned to the variable x, then we convert that string into an integer, so v is equal to the integer 10. No errors were raised, so we simply skip all these lines and then we go to line number 8. So since there was no exception raised, we execute line number 9 and we print out done, and then finally is executed regardless of whatever happens, so we simply print out done. And just to show the other scenario, so you see over here is that what you see here is that x is equal to the string hello, which cannot be converted in integer, so in line number 3 we raise a value error. We skip line number 4 and 5, we go to line number 6 and then we see, hey, we got a value error, so we execute line number 7, which is to print cannot convert string with characters to an integer, which is what happens here. And since an exception was raised, the else block is skipped because the else block is only executed when there is no error raised. Then we go to the finally block, which is always executed whether or not there was an error, and then we print out done. All right, so this is what we get over here. Let me convert this back to 10, and what I'll try to do is, let's make another variable c maybe, and then v is equal to the integer 10, right? So I'll take v divide by 0. Okay, so what happens here is that this is a valid line since the string 10 is assigned to x, then over here v is equal to 10, then we compute 10 divided by 0, which raises a 0 division error. So we print out cannot divide by 0, which is what we get here, right? We skip these two lines, then we go to else, and since there was an exception, we don't execute this block, and then we go to finally, and we print out done. All right. Now let's remove this line and replace this with x. So what happens here is that we still get an error. All right. So this time we get a type error. So what happens here is that we are trying to divide a string with an integer. All right. So we get a type error. This is again not a zero division error because a zero division error happens when you're dividing two integers. When you're trying to divide an integer with 0, that's what happens. Then a zero division error is raised at that time. But here we are trying to divide a string with a number, which is a type error, right? Because the types are wrong. So again, the type error is completely different from zero division error and value error. So these two blocks are skipped and basically the error is now recognized and is raised and it simply stops our program. And we are trying to print out done at the end of the program, but you can see that it is not being printed. Oh, in fact, it is being printed, all right. But anyway, we want to avoid this very long traceback message. So the thing is that there's so many types of errors in Python, and you basically want to have a way to cover all those errors. And we can do that by putting except exception. All right, print there is an error. All right. So now we have there is an error. So what happens here is that exception again refers to every single type of error that could happen in Python. So over here you can see that what happened here was a type error. So it doesn't match this. So value, so type error is not equal to zero division error, so this is skipped. Then we check if type error is equal to value error, which is again not true. Then we check if type error is an exception, and in fact type error is an exception because the exception word covers all types of errors, and we print this out. Then the else block is skipped because there was an exception, and the finally block is printed whether there was an error or not. So in this case it was executed, and then we print out done. All right, so there is an error, done. All right, so yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, there are so many types of exception that it's best if you just learn about them. So one type of error is the file not found exception. Sorry, file not found error. That's what it's called. And if you want to try it out, you can basically try to do something like f open hello.txt. Again, this is not a file that exists. As you can see in my folder here, the folder only contains one Python file, which is try_except.py. And yeah, so this should give a, so again, so there is a file not found error over here, but my exception block basically catches it since it is categorized over there. But if I remove this, you can see that I get a file not found error, which is over here. So I encourage you to explore this out, the file not found error. And yeah, there are many other types of error, and you can simply learn about it. It's very important in Python since exception handling is a very common concept that's used in Python programming. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. If you like this video, then please consider giving a like and subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you in another video.